Hey guys, what's going on? It's Ben here, and today I'm going to be doing a video regarding the New Jersey Nets. Yes, the New Jersey Nets, not the Brooklyn Nets. This was back when they were New Jersey. I'm going to be talking about basically why they weren't as good as you would have thought during the Jason Kidd, Vince Carter era. So I think when you initially think about that team, Jason Kidd, about basically one of the best, if not the best point guard in the game in the early to mid 2000s. And then you think, oh, Vince Carter, behind Kobe, he was like probably the second best shooting guard, maybe him or Ray Allen in those early 2000s. Dwayne Wade came on the scene a little later, but there was a time when it was like Kobe and then Vince Carter and Tracy McGrady and Ray Allen sort of in the second tier. So you might think to yourself, wow, those two guys, perennial all-stars, basically the best point guard and arguably the second best shooting guard in the game. Throw in Richard Jefferson, who's good for 20 points a game on efficient shooting and 5 and 5. And what's the problem? Why didn't they ever reach an NBA Finals, let's say, in the always weak Eastern Conference of the NBA during the mid-2000s? How were they not able to defeat anybody? Well, I'm going to explain that a bit in this video, and I'm going to explain why they basically, I do not want to say failed, but fell short of expectations when they had two of the best players in the NBA and a really solid, perfect third option for the team. So going back a little bit, I'm going to start with the first year that they made it to the finals in 2001 or 2002. They won 52 games. They were first in the East. I'll run down their basic core here. Their starting lineup was Jason Kidd, Kerry Kittles, Keith Van Horn, Kenyon Martin, and starting at center they had a guy named Todd McCullough. So the first four guys, not Todd, but the first four, each averaged around 14 to 15 points per game. J. Kidd had around 11 assists a game. Everyone performed pretty well. They got to the finals. No amazing scorer for J. Kidd to feed. So they didn't win the finals, but they had a solid team, and they played team basketball. And with Jason Kidd at the helm, he got the best out of everybody. And so following that season, they switched it up a little bit because they thought they needed a better center presence than Todd McCullough. So they traded Keith Van Horn, their small forward, for Dikembe Mutombo. Now on the season before, 2001-2, when they made it to the finals, they did have Richard Jefferson as a rookie sixth man off the bench who was averaging 9 points a game. And I think that they were comfortable with trading Keith Van Horn because they knew that they had Richard Jefferson off the bench to help out and fill in for him, and he could easily step into that starting small forward role. So they did that. They pulled the trigger. They did that trade, Van Horn for Dikembe Mutombo, who was coming off of two good seasons with the 76ers, one in which they went to the finals, and another in which they were a solid playoff team but just didn't happen to reach the finals. So Dikembe is now the starting center, and your core is looking like J. Kidd, Kerry Kittles, Jefferson at the 3, Martin at the 4, with Dikembe as a starting 5. And not really much of a bench, but it's okay because that's a really stacked starting 5. But then the main problem was Dikembe didn't play much in that season, 02-03, and they had to just have their backup center fill in for most of the year. I think he only played about 20 games in the regular season, and he did come back for the playoffs, but he really wasn't that healthy, and the coach, Byron Scott, didn't really want to play him, so he was benched. But either way, without that aside, which is the core of Kidd, Kittles, Jefferson, and Martin, they once again reached the finals this year. They were second in the conference with 49 wins. They lost to the Spurs in 6 games, but they put up a decent fight, and they're still like the two-time Eastern defending champs, so people have a lot of confidence in them. And really the East is theirs, honestly. The next season, they repeat their success basically in the regular season. They go from 49 to 47 wins, but they're still second in the East, and their core is still, actually Dikembe Mutombo left in free agency, but then they acquired, for basically nothing, they acquired an older Alonzo Mourning to start at center for them. And he did decent, but he was getting older and more injury prone. Let's see here. He played around, I want to say 50 regular season games, 40 to 50, and he averaged around 10 and 10, so decent. Their starting lineup again looked like Kidd, Kittles, Jefferson, Martin, and Alonzo Mourning, and all those same guys were basically putting up similar stats to what they had been, around 14 to 15. Jefferson was averaging around 16 to 17, getting upwards 18 to 19. So he was playing really well. He was maybe like the leading scorer on the team, but they just played really good, cohesive team basketball. But then in this year, they won in the first round against the Knicks, but then in the second round, they lost to the Pistons in the semifinals. And, nothing had really changed. The Pistons had honestly just gotten a lot better, and the Nets had stayed at the same level. So basically, they just realized that they needed to get better. So going into 04-05, this is really when the Vince Carter era started. Mid-season at the trade deadline, they trade an aging Alonzo Mourning and a bench guy named Eric Williams, who was a decent player. He was averaging 12 to 13 points a game for the Nets in this season. They traded those two guys and another guy who was a bench scrub named Aaron Williams. They traded them to the Raptors in exchange for Vince Carter, who was very displeased with Toronto at the time. And so they got a Vince Carter who is now happy because he was on the Nets, a new team that was a playoff contender. So in 04-05, they actually had a lot of dysfunction that year in that Richard Jefferson, who before Carter got there was their leading scorer at 22 points per game, only played 33 games that year. So he was out for the rest of the regular season and the playoffs after that at that point. So they were really struggling. They needed a boost. They knew that they needed to make a splash to keep up with the Pistons in the East. So they pulled the trigger on Vince Carter. He got there and he just played awesome. He was shooting 46% from the field, 43% from three-point land. He was averaging 28 points, 6 rebounds, and 5 assists a game, and around 2 steals a game. Jason Kidd was playing still at a similar level as he always had been. His assists were down a little bit, but he was still averaging 14 and 8 and 2 steals a game, 7 rebounds. So still his similar level of production. And what we saw this year was the emergence of a guy named Nenad Kristic, who you may not know much about, but he became their starting center after they traded Alonzo Mourning. He was averaging 10 and 5 for them, which is decent. He was basically their next option after those top 3 guys, and their third option really after Jefferson was out of the team. I should also mention the team chemistry changed a lot this year in that Kerry Kittles left because his contract was up and they didn't want to re-sign him because he was out of shape. Basically, not as in he was old, but his joints were just really bad. And Kenyon Martin left in free agency because he thought the Nets lowballed him, so he went to the Nuggets. So the starting lineup by the playoffs was looking a lot different, but I'll just give you what it would have been if everyone was healthy, to include Jefferson. The starting lineup was Jason Kidd, Vince Carter, Richard Jefferson, and then Jason Collins and Nenad Kristic. After the trade of Mourning, Nenad Kristic stepped in the starting lineup. And in the playoffs with Richard Jefferson injured, they had this guy named Rodney Buford who was starting, but he wasn't all that good. Averaging 7 points a game, 1 assist a game, 3 rebounds, basically just a bench scrub. But their primary guys coming off the bench were Cliff Robinson, who was playing 21 points a game, missed a lot of the regular season, and Brian Scalabrine, the White Mamba, who was playing 22 minutes a game, averaging 6 points. But they really, at this point, didn't have much of a bench presence. And, this issue was compounded by the fact that they traded for Vince Carter because he had a huge contract, so they couldn't really get much help off the bench. But essentially, at this point, it went from a team where it was like, oh, we're going to have 5 guys that are all good players to like, we're going to have 3 guys that are like really like all-star level star players and not much depth. So that was 04-05. But because of the injury to Jefferson, They struggled a lot during the regular season. The injury to Alonzo Mourning too. He didn't play a ton. I said he played 40 to 50 games, but now looking here, he actually played only 20 games in the regular season. So because of that, they finished with only a 42-40 record, and they lost in the first round to the Heat, who had won 60 games, so that's understandable. But now this next year, they came back and were looking to be a title contender again. This is the 1 year of this team where they had all three of these guys in their prime, like ready to play and ready to do well. No one between Jefferson, Nash, and Carter each played 78 games or more, so they had them all for the whole season. Then they had Kristich, who had improved a lot, played 80 games this season, and Jason Collins played 71, so they had all their starters healthy for the whole year. Again, with the big contract of Carter, they didn't really have any room to improve their bench, so it's really those five guys were who they relied on. They had Cliff Robinson playing 23 minutes a game, but he was the sixth man. And at this point, Scalabrine had left for the Celtics in free agency. But 05 to 06, they were looking pretty good. They won 49 games. They were third in the East behind the Pistons and the Heat. They got to the playoffs. They won in the first round. Oh, let me go over the guys' averages real quick. Richard Jefferson averaging 20 a game with 7 rebounds and 4 assists. Kidd averaging 13 points, 7 rebounds, and 8 assists a game. Carter averaging 24, 6, and 4. Kristich averaging 14 and 6. And Jason Collins, who really wasn't a stats guy, he was just a good defensive guy. He was averaging 4 points and 5 rebounds, and one steal and 1 block a game. So not great stats for him, but Cliff Robinson off the bench averaging 7 points. So as you can tell, if he's their sixth man, he's not that great. But they're really putting all their eggs into their starters basket with not much depth. And they got to the second round versus the Heat, and they actually lost pretty badly again. I was really surprised that they lost this series. Jason Kidd, Richard Jefferson, and Vince Carter, I think that that's more talented than Shaq, Dwayne Wade, and Antoine Walker as sort of big three versus big three. But I think Dwayne Wade was better at this point than... Dwayne Wade and Vince Carter were about equal talent at this point, and Shaq was probably about equal with Jason Kidd, and Jefferson was better than Antoine Walker. But the real difference was the Heat had a lot of depth. They had off the bench James Posey, they had Jason Williams as a passing prodigy off the bench. They had an older Alonzo Mourning who was healthy off the bench, so they had some decent guys off the bench there. They had good contributors in the starting lineup too. Haslam was a good starter for them. Gary Payton they had, older in his career but still valuable. So they just had overall more depth, I'd say, than the Nets did, and I think that might be the difference because their star players are pretty equal. But you'd say that essentially the Heat had about 8 guys that they could rely on in a given game, whereas the Nets had, as far as scoring, 4, and as far as defense, 5. But still, like you can see that there's a pretty significant difference there. So I would say that contributed to why they lost in this season in the second round to the Heat. But still, I'd say like they were about, despite losing 4-1, I'd say talent-wise they were about even with them. The Heat went on to win the championship that year, but the Nets were a solid contender that season. And then in the next year, the Nets were, let's see here, 06 to 07 we're discussing. Kidd and Carter were healthy for the season, playing 80 or more games, but Richard Jefferson missed about 27 games, and Nenad Kristich missed a lot of the season. He only played in 26 games. So their starting lineup was looking for the majority of the year like Carter, Jason Kidd, Richard Jefferson, Mikey Moore, who was a decent guy, kind of a role player, and then Jason Collins at center. Again, really nothing off the bench. Eddie House is their best bench player. He was averaging 8 points a game as sort of an instant offense guy. When Kristich was playing for 26 games, he was doing really well. He averaged 16 points and 7 rebounds a game, which is good. In this season, Carter averaged 25 points a game. Kidd averaged 13, 8, and 9. Jefferson averaged 16, and then Kristich averaging 16. Mikey Moore averaging 10 and 5. So decent contributions from the starting lineup, about what you want, but really nothing from the bench, which again hurt them. But it was their own problem because Vince Carter had a really big contract, so they couldn't really afford quality bench guys. But it's just a problem that they had upon themselves. With the injuries to Kristich and Jefferson, the Nets kind of spiraled during the regular season, basically only being able to rely on Carter and Kidd for offense. They finished 42-40 as the 8th seed. Or no, let's see here, sorry. 41-41 as the 6th seed. They actually upset the Raptors in the playoffs. They were the 3, the Nets were the 6, so they upset them. And that's because Richard Jefferson was back and was healthy for the playoffs. He was able to contribute 20 points a game, which was helpful. So they were more like, they were better than their seeding showed them to be. And so they propelled to the second round. But in the second round, they lost to LeBron. And if you don't know about this season with LeBron, this was the year that he got to the finals basically single-handedly with not much help on his team. But this is a year where I say, why couldn't the Nets beat the Cavaliers? It really upsets me. Like, yes, they didn't have Kristich, but he was only the 4th best player offensively on the team. They still had like the main keys to their team. They had Jefferson healthy for the playoffs. They had Jay Kidd. They had Vince Carter. So I don't get why they didn't do better in the playoffs. You know, really Vince Carter might have been a problem here. I'm looking at his stats. He shot below 40% from the field during the playoffs. Jason Kidd and Jefferson shot pretty decent, but he really tailed off a bit there. Kidd averaged 15, 11, and 11 in the playoffs. Carter on sub 400, 40% shooting. He had 22, 7, and 5, and then Jefferson had 26 and 2. Mikey Moore averaged 11 points a game in the playoffs, which is pretty decent. Jason Collins didn't do anything. Eddie House didn't do anything, really barely even played. But this is the year that I think that they could have made a finals run, honestly, and really blew it in my opinion. But this is the year that was their chance, I think. You know, they might have lost to the Pistons again because the Pistons had proved that they were a bit better. But also the Pistons didn't have Ben Wallace, who was their best defensive presence. So the Nets' offense in a conference final series against them might have been really able to flourish without that big defensive anchor in the middle. It would have been a toss-up. They might have been able to get to the finals. They probably would have been swept by or like lost badly to the Spurs because really, again, the lack of bench help was really hurting them during this season. Moving on to 2007 to 2008, this is sort of like the last year of this whole era with all these guys. They weren't that good this year. The 3 main guys were healthy, but again, besides that, Kristich coming back from injury really wasn't the same player. He started but was playing less than 20 minutes a game and was averaging 7 points and 4 rebounds a game, so he really was not the same player. And the rest of the lineup was just like aging, decrepit NBA players who were not that good. Because again, they were hamstrung by these big contracts from Kidd and Carter, and even Richard Jefferson had a decent-sized contract, but they were just struggling with the salary cap. But they only had these 3 guys. Kidd was getting older and regressing. He was 34 at this point. He was only averaging 11. He was actually averaging decent numbers, but his points was a bit down. He was averaging 11, 8, and 10. Carter was averaging 21, 6, and 5, and Jefferson averaging 23, 4, and 3. This season, it just wasn't enough anymore to only have 3 guys, and Carter was coming down. Like his game was declining, Kidd's game was declining. Richard Jefferson was probably about at his peak in this season, but a guy who's not even an all-star ever, Richard Jefferson, can't lead you to a finals, let alone a playoff team. So mid-season at the trade deadline, they traded away Jason Kidd for Devin Harris. He did all right. He came in and averaged 15 points a game with 7 rebounds. But really what they needed was a guy like Jason Kidd who could really make everyone around him better, especially with the team where you got a lot of guys coming off the bench who aren't that good. You need a guy who can really elevate their play, which Jason Kidd could do. But once he was gone, there just wasn't much magic left on this team. They finished 34-48 in 07-08, and essentially the era and their window with this core was over. So in conclusion, between 04 to 08, was the core of this team, 4 seasons. The last one, I'm going to just blame on them getting old and declining and eventually jumping ship and trading away Kidd. But the other 3 years, they finished 42-40, 49-33, and 41-41. Now, 04 to 05, I give them the biggest leeway because Carter was new, so they're still integrating him into the offense. Richard Jefferson was out for most of the year, so that hampered them. And really, Nenad Kristich was okay, but not great. But it was basically the Vince Carter and Jason Kidd show, and that's not enough to get you very far in the playoffs. So I can understand why they didn't do great that year. Now moving on, the 49-33 season of 05 to 06, they got to the second round and lost to the Heat. This year it was really a result of not enough depth. They had a decent starting lineup with featuring Jefferson, Kidd, Carter, and Kristich, but they didn't have really anything off the bench. Eddie House, but he was good during the regular season, but barely even played during the playoffs. So, any other team can do better than that. When you can only put out 4 quality NBA players, it's going to be hard to win games in the playoffs when the situations are pressurized and guys are already getting really tired. You need to have at least 7 to 8 guys who can put in some good minutes and be reliable, but they didn't have that. And then 06 to 07, they got to the second round, and they were the 6th seed because Jefferson missed a decent amount of time and Kristich went out for the season after 26 games. So really it was again the Jason Kidd and Vince Carter and nobody else show. But come to the playoffs, they had their core 3 all healthy and ready. They upset the 3 seed and got to the semifinals and then lost to LeBron and Larry Hughes and Ilgauskas. But they really could have won that series. They lost 4-2, but they had the more talented team to me. This is the one that's most disappointing to me. I definitely think that they could have made it to the finals potentially, but they lost to an undermanned LeBron team, and they could have probably challenged, if not beaten, a Detroit team that was lacking their defensive anchor who had left in Ben Wallace. Ultimately, to sum up, I'm going to say the main factors that this team didn't succeed as much as they were supposed to is because of number 1, injuries, and number 2, depth. The contracts of their main stars got in the way of them adding depth to the team. When they were at their best during this run, they had 4 good quality NBA players who could really be relied upon. And at their worst, they had times where it was just Jason Kidd and Vince Carter who could be relied upon, and really no one else on the team because of injuries. But contracts hampering their adding of depth and injuries. Those are what I'm going to say are the 2 problems with this core that really could just never catch a break, honestly. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video, found it informative, gained a little bit more information on why this team didn't succeed. And if you have any comments, leave them below. I'd love to hear from you. And I hope you enjoyed the video. Have a good day, guys. Bye.